I will be hosting the webinar today. Before we begin our session, there are a few quick housekeeping points. For participants listening in French, click on the floor at the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on the document on the right. Feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on Documents on the right. There will be a Q&A during the last 5 minutes of the webinar. To submit your question, please go to the toolbar on the right, click on Messaging and then Participant, and type in your question. You can submit your questions at any time. If you're watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking Participant. We will now begin our discussion. So welcome everyone, and welcome to System Expectation, working with newcomers and immigrant and refugee families. Today, what we'll be talking about is a quick overview of our talk today. Will be a discussion around demographic information, migration experience, immigration status, barriers to managing expectation, and cultural competency. When we talk about system, we talk in terms of a broad definition, which means that this could be any organization, public, private, nonprofit, that at some point will or may provide services to newcomers' families. As such, a system could be a police or the judicial system. It could be child protection or child welfare system. It could be a hospital or the medical system, mental health provider, and so on. A system could also be seen as a group of related parts that work together. In other words, interconnecting networks, such as a CYAC. But before we begin, let's look at some of the numbers in terms of what do we talk about when we're talking about immigrants, newcomers, and refugees in Canada. So as you can see, this is one of the projection from 2019 to 2021 that Immigration Canada has put together in order to decide on how many newcomers and how many immigrants they will be accepting each year. It's important to look at the left side, which describes the categories of newcomers to Canada, and the right side mentions the numbers of newcomers that are expected to arrive each year. And in terms of the next 3 years, we will have, so the projection for 2019 is around 330,000, and by 2021 it will be around 350. The reason why this is important to understand and to also realize is, have you observed any kind of trend in your services, in services offered to newcomers or immigrant family? In other words, have you seen some of these numbers reflected in the type of clients that you see? And if yes, what have you done about it? If no, is there a reason why some of these clients are not coming to see you? So part of the presentation really is to just some of these issues related to the numbers of newcomers that come into Canada, and if your organization is prepared to work with them in a culturally sensitive manner. The next slide deals with a breakdown of the number of permanent residents that are admitted into Canada. So this stats is from 2017. And as you can see, it breaks down into different territories and provinces. And once again, it's always good to pay close attention to the categories of immigrants that are accepted in each provinces or territories. As you can see, for example, when it comes to economic immigrants, certain provinces have a lot more percentage than others. When it comes to family reunification, there's certain provinces that has There's certain provinces that has more, others less, and that gives you an idea of how the immigrant population in Canada is spread each year when they first arrive. One of the things that we'll be talking about is, and part of the reason why the presentation is about newcomers / immigrant and refugees, is because these two categories are very different from one another in terms of how they immigrate to Canada. So it's also important to keep in mind how people immigrate once they're here, the immigration status, and the type of resources that are available for them and that they are able to access. So just to take an example, since we are currently in Ontario, as you can see, in terms of economic immigrants, this is about 46%. In terms of family, 32%, and in terms of refugee and protected class, about 19%. But overall, it's a big number. But and the total number of immigrants accepted each year in each province is at the bottom, and you can see that Ontario has one of the largest, with close to 100,000 each year. The next slide speaks as to once they arrive, or before they arrive, are they able to speak the language? In other words, English or French. And once again, it's important to keep in mind, the difference between newcomers, immigrants, and refugee class, because it also applies to their ability once they come here to speak English or French. As you can see, when it comes to economic and family, immigrants, their ability to speak French or English is a little bit higher than the refugees and protected class of people, and that speaks to your ability to provide services to refugees, and the need for possibly language services when you meet with refugee clients. And it's important to also be aware of the barriers that this could cause in accessing services, in continuing services, and ultimately to be successful in the delivery of the services. So just a quick resettlement trend that has been happening. So between January 2015 and December 2017, Canada has admitted approximately 94,000 resettlement refugees. 51,000 of them were from Syria. And this is a great number, and this is an important number, is because once they arrive here, they would need to be able to access the different type of services, and they will come into contact with the different type of systems that we mentioned earlier. In other words, the police, child protection, hospital, and other agencies that may be able to support them. So, as I mentioned before, once you know that these numbers are coming up, what is it that your organizations or as providers that you're doing in order to meet these numbers, in order to meet this need that's going to be continuing growing throughout the years? As you can see, close to 20, and they're still close to 92,000 in need of resettlement out of the 1.4 million refugees. So these are some of the numbers to keep in mind when working in a diverse setting, when working towards providing services to newcomers and refugees' families. I think part of the talk today will be to talk about expectations. So in other words, when newcomers and refugees' families come to you or come to access services, your organization has certain expectation in terms of how you will be delivering these services. But at the same time, the newcomers and the refugees' families, they have their own expectation into how they would like to receive those services. So what is the most important thing to do is to make sure that those expectations match. because if not, then this is when services are not provided the right way. They may not be accessing services long term. They may not come back for services. So that's why that it's very important to pay close attention to the population that you are serving, and to also pay close attention to the migration history of those that you are serving. So speaking of migration history, it is very important to always it is always very important to always understand who we are welcoming and where they come from. But what's most important, it's also to understand how did they come here, and that this is really big. Come here, and that this is really big. This is really the beginning of how to manage system expectation, understanding the migration history, the strength of the migration history that this type of population have, and also some of the stressors associated with the migration history. So this is where we will be dividing the two categories in terms of people that choose to immigrate to Canada, and people really that do not choose to immigrate but are resettled. And then sometimes people tend to forget that when it comes to refugee populations, they really don't have a choice in terms of where they get resettled. The ones that decides to immigrate, go through a process, and that it's the choice to immigrate is theirs. But the ones that are in refugee camps, or the ones that are in refugee camps, or the ones that are in war-torn countries, the ones that are then resettled into Canada, those do not choose where they are resettled. So the first step in understanding the migration history is really to understand, the conditions in the home country. Where do they come from? What was happening in their home country that led them to either willingly immigrate to Canada, or that forced them to be resettled in Canada. Part of the migration experience, it's always good to remember that before people come to Canada, they do have a history, because sometimes what we do is that once they arrive, we tend to forget where they come from, or we don't pay much attention as to their history prior to coming to Canada. So I think they have a history before they arrived here, and that history is full of strength, is full of hope, and at the same time is also full of stressors, depending on how they decided to come. So one of the big things is to know the conditions in the home country, to know their status in terms of were they doctors, engineers in their home country before immigrating, and also the experience in the home country, and the experience could be where they had to flee a war. They had to, because of their activities, they were persecuted by the government from their home country. So all these little things are important to know, because that's part of their history. That's part of who they are. That's part of their history. That's part of who they are. That's part of what makes them able to, adapt to a new environment, have access to resources, or just being able to navigate the system a lot easier, while others may not have had an opportunity to have some of these experiences, and as such may need a little bit more support once they arrive here. So the second step in the migration history is the reason for leaving the country. Like I mentioned before, some are pushed in terms of coming here, and these are the refugees and the protected class populations, and some decides to come in. Some decides, it's a good time for me to move to a new country, to learn for whatever reason, economic reason, family, for whatever reason, economic reason, family reason, as we mentioned before, and those are the ones that prepare themselves before coming. And so that's the reason why it is really important to always make that distinction in terms of the people that decide to come and the people that are resettled. Then right after the reason for coming here, as I mentioned, it was because of civil war, because of persecution, or because of economic reason. Before they arrive to Canada, for example, they may transition into a third country, and that's another big important factor to consider. So, in other words, one may go through their home country, then transition to the U.S. before moving to Canada, and that transition could take a few years. Could take a few years, a few months, to many years. And the same applies to the refugees populations. So, in other words, once they flee their home, they may end up in a third country. And taking the example of the Syrians, for example, a lot of them, were resettled in Turkey or in other neighboring countries. Some other refugees in Africa were also resettled in different countries in Africa that accepted refugees. So that transition period is also an important period to remember, and is also an important period to take into account when providing services and when working with newcomers and refugees' families. So, as I mentioned before, the refugees really don't have a choice as to where they end up, and there's really no time frame as to when they will be resettled into Canada, the US, or any other countries. So you've had refugees who've fled, for example, Sudan or the Congo, and have resettled in Kenya and have spent close to 10 years in Kenya before being resettled to a third country. And that those experiences in that country are very important experiences, and those are also something to take into account, because the ability of these populations to adapt, to be able to navigate the system, will also depend on that transition into the third country that they were in. So it's always important to remember that there is, just because somebody says that they're from a specific country, they're not able to adapt because they've transitioned into a third country. So in other words, somebody coming through the US, for example, may have an easier time transitioning into Canada than somebody who transitioned from Sudan to Kenya, then to Canada. So part of the migration experience and the migration history is that in every step, there are strengths and some stressors that affects the ability of some of these populations to be able to access services, to be able to adapt to a new way of life, and so forth and so on. So the third part, the fourth actually part of the migration is the response to either the people that are resettled or the people that chooses to come. Usually, the people that chooses to come, prepare themselves well if they have family support in terms of once they arrive here. But when it comes to refugees and protected class, that's when the resources are needed the most, because they pretty much come in with nothing. They are, from one day to the next, they are moved from what they knew most of their life to something completely different, to something completely new. And this is where there might be a loss of resources for them when they come in. There's also a loss of resources and then we'll talk about that a little bit later on, for the ones that are choosing to come. But in terms of loss of resources for the refugees and the protected class, that the loss of those resources are greater. So then, right after that, then the adjustment period begins, into culture. And then once they're here, then they will most likely start accessing or coming into contact with the different systems. So that's why it's very important to always keep in mind that once you have somebody in front of you that's a newcomer or immigrant or refugees, that their life experiences and their migration history are very important to take into account, because this is where they've learned coping skills in terms of how to deal with adversity. But also at the same time, there are stressors associated with it, or some of their experiences that they lived in their home country may affect the way they deal with or they work with, for example, the police or child protection or other entities or systems. So it's really important to always keep in mind that the migration, how to look at somebody that comes to you for services. So part of the migration history, is tied in with the immigration status, because once they come here, and then this is related to resources as well. So once they come here, they come on the different categories. They're the ones that that are able to come as permanent resident right away, and those may be coming in with more resources to be able to adjust, to be able to start a new life in Canada. But like I mentioned before, like the refugee populations may not be coming in with much more than what were given to them, when they got on the plane. So based on their immigration status, they may be able to access certain resources, and they may not be able to access other resources. For example, for permanent residents, that individual who have permanent residency are able to access all government resources and non-government financial services. Refugees are also able to access some of these resources, but because of their classification, sometimes they are supported for 12 months, and after the 12 months, they may need additional services. Refugee claimants, for example, are people that are already here and decides they cannot go back to their home country because of fear of being persecuted, and some of them because of that status may not be able to access a lot more than refugees or permanent residents. So immigration status does play a role in the type of services that they're able to access, and also the type of financial resources that they may have in order to settle into Canada. Another category is the spouse and family sponsor. This is where a spouse that's already in Canada is sponsoring family members to come, and this is another category that's very interesting, because the spouse that's coming or that's being sponsored is dependent financially on the sponsor. So in other words, sometimes they may not be able to access other services because they're being sponsored to come here. And for certain cases, such as family violence cases where the abuser might be the one sponsoring the family, those are situations where the spouse may find themselves in a very tough situation in trying to access services, and because of their immigration, in a very tough situation in trying to access services, and because of their immigration status, they're very limited as to what they are able to access. Okay, so really, what we just talked about is some of the things to take into consideration when working with newcomers and refugees' families, and how to best manage some of those expectations once they come in. So in terms of some of the barriers to manage expectations, a lot of studies have shown that the lack of knowledge about the migration experience is a big barrier, because once again, as I mentioned before, if the person that you are working with is not meant to feel comfortable about sharing experiences, or is not being part of the process in terms of how they coped with certain situation, and they're just simply given prescription in terms of this is what you need to do, this is how you need to do it, without taking into account maybe that they have skills, or they have knowledge, or they have mastery of certain things on how to adapt. This may create a situation where the person in front of you may just shut down, may not respond well to your suggestion, may not respond well to your recommendations, because you've not taken the migration experience into account. And also, part of, as I mentioned before, a lot of them, depending on if they were, resettled or chose to come, may have different expectations. May have different expectations. May be able to, understand a lot quicker, some of the system's expectation in terms of how to access services, what's needed to access the services, how do you go about, accessing services, how systems are interconnected. For example, in terms of the judicial system, they're able to understand a little bit better some of those different expectations, that even though some of these entities are separate, they do speak to each other, and they do collaborate with each other, and some expectations are there for them to follow, versus somebody who who resettled in as a refugee and then came here. So they may not be able, they may not be familiar with some of these systems and what's expected in terms of, for example, for a mom who's lived in a war zone and resettled in a refugee camp in a third country, and when you may be speaking to her about safety, well, her idea of safety is keeping all of her children safe in that war, during her time in the refugee camp. So her idea and her definition of safety may be totally different from yours. And because of that, if the migration experience is not taken into account, you may not understand that safety for her meant keeping her child safe from being killed. And at that point, the conversation may not go very well if you are defining safety in a certain way without taking into account how this individual defines that word. So I think it also goes back and because of that, it may create a situation where expectation becomes very unrealistic from both sides. Another barrier to managing expectation is a lack of knowledge about immigration status. And I think it goes back to what I just mentioned in terms of, based on your immigration status, the type of services that you are able to receive, and the type of support that you're able to access. And so once again, if somebody is not able to access much services or much financial support because of their immigration status, so their ability to provide for their family might be very limited. But at the same time, also some of them may have to work in order to provide for that family, and and not understanding that family, and and not understanding that position as to their immigration status is tied in with resources, could create a situation, once again, that expectations in terms of next steps could be very unrealistic. And I think in terms of resources, I think it's important to remember, as I mentioned before, that there's a loss of resources in terms of people that are coming here, and that doesn't really, it doesn't matter if they were resettled here or if they came in on their own choosing. The social support system that they were used to is no longer there. So in other words, they could no longer rely on a neighbor, on an extended family member, or on their network to provide the extra support when some of these stressors the certain employment because they don't have quote unquote the Canadian experience. In other words, when some of them may be coming in as engineers, but because of the degree is not recognized here, they may not work as engineers. So there's a loss of, so the work that they do is really different from what they're used to. That would also go to, economic status in terms of, where they came from, what was, in type of economic status they had, and now coming here, it changes completely. So that loss of resources is something to always keep in mind, because it also it's also tied in, with their ability. It's about self-esteem. It's about being hopeful. It's about being optimistic about being in a new country, optimistic about being in a new country and being able to navigate the different system and being able to provide for one's family and so forth. So it's always important to also to keep that in mind. The next barrier is the mutual cultural misunderstanding, and I think that has to do with not only the newcomer and refugees not understanding the culture that they're moving into, in terms of how things are done, and what are some of these expectations in terms of when they come into contact with a system, for example, and the mutual cultural misunderstanding has to do with maybe how they dealt with maybe similar system back home. For example, if for them, dealing with the police was mainly to call them when they needed a situation to be resolved, but not to the extent, for example, where if the police is called here, they will, the police will go out, would investigate if a crime has been committed, and if a crime has been committed, somebody will be arrested. But the experience with the police back home could have been where, calling the police is just to be able to resolve a situation that happened without anybody being arrested, or if their experience with the police back home was very concerning in terms of abuse or persecution. So once they come into contact with the police here, or with the child protection system, or with the hospitals, or with the mental health system, though they may not understand, how to best receive the services, and at the same time the system may not receive the services, and at the same time the system may not understand how to best provide those services. So the mutual cultural misunderstanding is a big piece to always to pay close attention to, and it's something that needs to be made aware when dealing with this population. Another barrier, of course, is the lack of language access. As we spoke earlier, depending on how new immigrants come to Canada, some of them may have already a strong understanding of the English language or the French language, and some may not, just like the refugee populations. And because of the language barriers, this may also be another source of stressors, and this may well be a source of not understanding some of these expectations that one may need to provide also has to do with the fact that certain situation would need to be to take place with an interpreter, and when it comes to interpretation, it's important to always remember, for example, that the interpretation is done in a way that's culturally appropriate, and that respects some of the norms, or the cultural the cultural norms and values that some of these families may have. So, for example, when using an interpreter, I think most of the time, or some of the time, the parent may come into into contact with the system with their children, where the children are the ones that actually, picked up the language a lot faster than their parents, and sometimes the children are made to translate for their parents. And I think this is where also this could be a big barrier in terms of working with newcomers and immigrant families and refugees families, where children are made to translate for their parents. So I think this is one of the big issues where it's always important to use interpretation services, and it's always important to use the right kind of interpretation services. So what do we need to do in order to better prepare ourselves for interacting and working with newcomers and refugee families? I think one of the things to always keep in mind that are just cultural aspect of things, right? It's to be culturally sensitive to who's coming. It's important to be culturally aware of where the person comes from, some of the norms and rules, and guided by those cultures. So part of it as service providers or as systems, it is important to pay close attention to how culturally competent are we in providing services to this type of populations. And cultural competency, I think, begins with being culturally aware of the difference, and what needs to be done to bridge that gap. It also goes to knowledge acquisition in terms of what needs to be done in order to provide services that are culturally sensitive, and it's about developing a skill to be able to work with this type of population and provide the services that are needed for these type of populations. So cultural awareness really speaks to developing a sensitivity and an understanding of another cultural group. But before one is able to understand or to actually begin understanding someone else's culture, it's always important to also become self-aware of who you are, some of the what your culture is, and because that usually speaks to in terms of attitude and values. In other words, when you come into contact with someone from a different cultural group, and because that usually speaks to in terms of attitude and values. In other words, when you come into contact with someone from a different cultural group, it's important to always keep in mind some of the biases that one may have, some of the stereotype that one may have. So I think the cultural awareness in terms of cultural competency begins with the self. It begins with understanding where some of your limitations are, in understanding somebody else's point of view, in understanding somebody else's culture, and what are some of these barriers that causes that issue where there's some sort of misunderstanding and you are not able to provide culturally sensitive services. So self-awareness is a big piece in terms of being culturally sensitive, and of course that comes with certain culture or some of the stereotype that you may hold towards a certain culture. And part of it also has to do with how someone understands concept, right? Such as family values, gender role, help-seeking behavior, parenting, and faith. Most of the time we do speak in terms of individual versus collective, as more like the cultural norm in Canada and in a lot of Western countries has to do with the individual, and as opposed to some part of the world where the collective is given a lot more weight than the individual. So when it comes to individual versus collective, I think one needs. It's about really collective. I think one needs. It's about really how individual define themselves and their relationship with others, especially the cultural group to which they belong. So it's really how one defines himself, and then how do they and how do they interact with others. For example, when it comes to family values, from an individualistic perspective, one may, identify themselves as a parent, and as a parent to his children, and that's pretty much ends there. But sometimes, in a more collective way, family values are not limited to the nuclear family. Family values are actually an extension of family values are actually an extension of uncles, aunt, grandparents, and because of that, all these other entities have something to say in terms of how one functions within a family. Another issue, it's about gender roles, right? How one sees the dynamics between, one person versus another in a family structure. Is it more in terms of being an individual that has the ability to make choices and make those choices for themselves first, or is it something in terms of, do we think of everyone, and do we take everyone's opinion when making another one of the big piece is the help seeking behavior, and then that's when and then he also refers back to what I mentioned earlier about the migration experience. So in other words, for somebody that has lived in a society that relies heavily on kin, and that relies heavily on extended family, so their help-seeking behavior in terms of seeking help may be about reaching out to that network first. So if something, if they're concerned about something, or they're not sure about something, what they will do first is they will tap into that network, because this is how they view help, in terms of receiving help, in terms of seeking help. But then when it comes to a more individualistic expression of help-seeking behavior, systems are put in place to get that help. For example, so if there's a situation where you don't feel safe, the first thing you may do is contact the police. However, somebody who's more in terms of tapping into the extended network may contact an uncle, may contact a grandfather for help. When a child may be sick, they may be seeking advice from an elder, or they may be seeking advice from someone they feel knows a little bit about the child illness. So that doesn't mean that it's right or wrong, but this is how they go about seeking support, seeking help. So that's why it's always important to keep in mind that the way they see themselves and the way they see themselves in relationship to others will inform how they go about getting support. Just like when it comes to parenting versus child rearing, parenting will be more in terms of mom and dad, or partners providing that parenting to children, when in a more collective way, child rearing speaks in terms of the whole network that we spoke about, the extended family, the aunts and uncles, the grandparents. So all those have a say in how the child is raised, and those recommendations are taken into account. Another aspect of things is faith, and how faith plays a major role in someone's life, and also that could be in terms of just simply one person and their faith, but it could be one person and the relationship that they have with their faith in terms of a collective. And that also plays a big role in how they see themselves and how they see their relationship with others. So understanding worldview is a big is an important concept to always keep in mind, because once again, in some of these expectations in terms of one may work with a family where they may need to seek advice from an elder, or they may need to seek advice from an extended family member before they make a decision. So it's not that they're not accepting services. It's not that they are being difficult. It's not that they are not cooperating, but it's that the way they see themselves is they see themselves in part of the collective, and before they make any kind of decision, they need to be able to access some of these extended family members to be able to feel comfortable with the decision that they will be making. So as I mentioned before, knowledge acquisition is a big part of cultural competency, and this has to do about just learning about other diverse group. It's important to know about the demographic characteristic, what we talked about in terms of where do they come from, their migration experience, what was their experience with oppression, right? Just like I mentioned earlier, they may be coming in, they may decide to come to Canada because they've been oppressed as to where they came from, and then looking for a safer environment for themselves and for their family. And I think it's also important to always focus on the strength. In other words, as I mentioned, some of these families have gone through a lot to come here and have been able to manage difficult situations, and also so those are the strength. It's important to focus on the strength. It's important to focus on the strength of a mother or a family where they've been able to keep their children safe during wartime. They've been able to keep their children safe, in refugee camps, and how they were able to do that. It's something that needs to be explored. It's something that needs to be used. That it's something that needs to be explored. It's something that needs to be used with these families. Another part of cultural competency is having cultural humility, and really cultural humility is about taking a step back, right, in terms of being less deterministic, less authoritative approach to understanding cultural differences, placing more value on the child and family's own cultural expressions as they relate to their situation. So how are you able to translate what you're trying to provide within their cultural framework? And I think that sometimes is the hardest part. Is it's in maintaining, in managing expectations. It's really to be able to take a step back. It's like, okay, what can I do to be able to translate what my expectations are that fits the person I'm working with, cultural expressions and cultural norms. So a good one of the steps of cultural humility is about good communication skills and learning about culturally appropriate interaction techniques, promote trust building, allowing clients to clarify their life priorities. In other words, like I mentioned before, who's defining the problem and how the problem is being defined is a big piece in building that trust, and reducing that power imbalance between worker and client. In other words, do you take into account their pre-migration history, and do you focus on strength, or do you mainly focus on the issue that they came to see you for, and using those cultural factors to make a better assessment. Skill development is really it's an ongoing thing in terms of being self-aware, being able to access knowledgeable, culturally appropriate activities where this is where the exchange needs to happen between when dealing with other cultures, and where to best get the best information on how to deal with someone from a different culture than yours. So I think that's where this is something that needs to happen constantly, and that needs to happen regularly. Well, it seems that we've come to the end of the webinar, and we'll be opening it up to questions.